Hello, this is Lady Boulay, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Thank you for your support. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your thumbs up, for your comments, and thank you for sharing the videos. Thank you for all you do to support the channel. And yes, we are commanded to love one another, whether we want to or not, or whether we agree with each other or not. So there's this Ethiopian woman named Wayne Tesfaye or Tesfa. But anyway, she's speaking on foundational Black Americans. Now, y'all know that I identify as Black American. I used to identify as ADOS. And then I decided I'm just going to identify as Black American. But to be clear, I am foundational Black American based on how it's used. So these are my people. So when somebody speaks on them and I decide I'm going to speak on them, then I have to speak in their behalf. I am duty bound to speak on their behalf because this is me. These are my people. So I'm going to let you listen to her speech and I'm going to interrupt her. But I want to know if you agree with her.
Today's episode is a direct response to an email I received after my last video about Black identity and why some Africans don't want to identify as Black. This email came from someone who identifies as a foundational Black American and who explained to me why they feel abandoned by other Black and immigrant communities and why they believe that FBA's divisiveness is justified. So today I want to break it down piece by piece why the victim mentality in FBA's rhetoric is dangerous and self-defeating, how FBA exceptionalism ignores the contribution by Africans to the Black liberation struggle, how US imperialism destroyed African nations, setting back the entire Black world, and last but not least, the ridiculous claim that foundational Black Americans are indigenous to America and have no ties to Africa.
So she gave this long academic sounding introduction, but what she's doing is trying to disguise her opposition to the delineation movement with what she's calling facts. And she starts out by reading a letter or an email that she claims she got from a foundational Black American. And what it really sounds like is that somebody had strung together a lot of stereotypes and a lot of talking points that Black Americans are talking about. That's what it sounds like. She didn't give the name of the person that wrote that letter. I would be interested to know who that person was because the language that she was using is not consistent with the language that FBA used. I don't believe that a foundational Black American wrote that letter. I don't. I believe that maybe some African who has been here a long time and who has listened to the discussion of FBA wrote this letter. And this lady, Wayne, is using that letter because she's got some things that she wants to get off her chest and is trying to make a case as to why Black Americans shouldn't delineate. And she needed to base it on something. So she's basing it on this email that sounds phony. And from there, she has a whole lot to say.
I want to approach this topic with honesty, clarity, and facts because conversations like these are so important. But we also need to unpack the problems with this mindset and how it contradicts historical and modern realities. Now, before I break down this email point by point, I want to read it for you. Wayne Tesfaye. Much of your perspective is correct. However, what you are missing is what exists at ground level. The divisiveness of the FBA labeling and description came about out of necessity in order to survive, exist. Black Americans for several decades strained, actually begging many times for unity with all ethnic groups of color, especially Africans from the motherland, because we have been on our own for hundreds of years and because we know the value and the need for unity for our survival. That was the reason that FBA's fought, died in the struggle to change laws so other people of color could come, unite, and help. But all they, FBAs, faced from those who have come were constant and forever belittling insults, labels, and facial looks of disgust. treating, speaking, looking down upon them, us, as though Black Americans are inferior. FBAs experienced this from all groups that have fled to America. All of these fleeing groups have said, let the Negro fight his own battles.
I'm going to repeat myself for emphasis. This sounds like a bunch of stereotypes that have been strung together. What she's saying are things that Black Americans have been saying since the 60s, but we've moved on past those talking points. We're on another trajectory now. So, first of all, FBA did not come out of necessity for survival. FBA is delineation to establish a lineage for reparations. This has nothing to do with surviving. We've already survived. We've already proven that we can survive. And we know that any immigrant group that comes to the United States aligns with white supremacy to fit in for their survival in the United States. This has nothing to do with our survival. It has to do with them trying to assimilate so they can survive here. So this is nothing new. So she continues with what FBA say about Black immigrants.
We do not want to align with them. These groups that flee from their lands come and say to the FBA, we do not care about your fight or your history. We have not come to fight. We have only come to make money and take care of our own. In essence, we do not care about this country or anything in it except for what we can drain and take from it for our own purposes. The displaying of their various country flags show this. I have personally been told this to my face, even recently before President Donald Trump's mass deportations. This causes and has caused great immense pain and humiliation within our community. We have given so much that they may come, and they turn their noses up at us. As Black Americans, we have developed a collective instinctive reaction response. We become hardened, as we have learned through hundreds of years without any help from the outside world, and that we must do this for survival against all who hurt us. These microaggressions permeate from those who flee throughout this land, so we have labeled them as cowards that have fled, wanting the proximity to whiteness, in order to obtain preferential treatment and favor above FBAs, and they have gotten it.
So here again, she got the talking points right, but not the context. When these Black immigrants brag that they don't want to be a part of any kind of struggle or any kind of activism, FBA are insulted by this and also are insulted by the fact that they want to come over here and benefit from our sacrifice and our struggle, but they don't want to be a part of the struggle and they don't want to put in any work. So FBA are righteously infuriated by this kind of cowardice. And that is what they call it. And they call them fleers. Now, what she wanted to say is, see, they are offended by the fact that Tariq Nasheed and some of the others call them fleers. You fled your responsibility in your homeland because you don't want to put in the work. And then you want to come over here and enjoy somebody else's sacrifice without putting in the work. See, she doesn't have the right context. And that is why I do not believe an FBA wrote this letter. She's trying to make it seem like this FBA person is so meek and humble. That's not the spirit you're getting from FBA these days.
So, let's break down this email point by point. Let's start with point number 1. The divisiveness of FBA labeling came out of necessity for survival. First, let's acknowledge an undeniable fact. Black Americans have been fighting for their survival for centuries, often alone. The trauma of slavery, Jim Crow, police brutality, and mass incarceration have forced African Americans to develop self-reliance and resilience in a way that is unique. No one is dismissing that. But here's the issue. Divisiveness is not survival. It's a reaction to pain and betrayal, but it's not a strategy for long-term power.
I hope y'all are picking up on how she's trying to intellectualize and trying to put the onus on Black Americans. Africans have been divisive all the time. We didn't need anybody to tell us that we are stronger when we're together. But Black Americans were carrying that Pan African burden for the longest. Now, when Black Americans are stepping back and saying, we're looking out for ourselves just like everybody else, then she's going to jump up here and say that it's divisive and it's not a strategy for long-term survival. Well, they need to know that. They're the ones that need to know that. We knew that from the beginning, but you couldn't get them to see that. Now she sees it. So, we just need to be aware of this particular kind of trickery.
If unity didn't work before, it's not because black people across the diaspora weren't trying. It's because white supremacy has always deliberately kept us apart.
So there again, there's nothing new. White supremacy has worked to keep black people apart.
The FBA response, instead of healing that division, is deepening it by turning on the very people who should be allies. So I challenge you, instead of saying we had to be divisive for survival, ask yourself, who benefits from that division? Because it surely isn't black people. Let's get to the next point, number 2.
Before she gets to the next point, let's be clear. It is not FBA's responsibility to heal black people. Again, black people have always understood the strategies of white supremacy and tried to tell them, but they wouldn't listen because they didn't want to work with us. I believe this woman means well. I believe she means well. And she's Ethiopian, and normally Ethiopians don't meddle into our business. I believe she was married to a Nigerian man, and she has 2 children by that Nigerian man, so maybe she's trying to stand in the gap for her children. But it is not the responsibility of black Americans to heal over 1 billion people on this planet. We would need some help. And when we were in the mode of trying to unify, they weren't interested. Now we've moved on to something else. And it's not because of survival. It's because we want our money. We're trying to get paid and we're trying to establish our own identity and dignity. So, they need to come back around in another. I don't know how long it'll be before foundational black Americans come back around. But I think they're going to have to just wait at this point.
FBAs fought and died so other people of color could come, unite, and help, but they never did.
Well, we need to straighten this statement out. FBA did not fight and die so other people could come to this country. FBA fought and died for our own liberation. Other people just happened to benefit from it.
This statement assumes that black immigrants have contributed nothing to the black struggle in America, which is historically false. Caribbean immigrants, for instance, played a very important role in the civil rights movement. Take Kwame Ture, for instance, who is from Trinidad and who has played an important role in the civil rights movement and the global Pan-African movement. Or Marcus Garvey, one of the most influential black leaders and who happened to come from Jamaica. Or let's take Malcolm X, whose mother was from the Caribbean island Grenada. Let's not forget to talk about the powerful and important role of African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, who was one of the most vocal African leaders in supporting the civil rights movement and black liberation in the United States. Kwame Nkrumah personally invited Martin Luther King to Ghana's independence celebrations in 1957. This visit profoundly impacted Martin Luther King, reinforcing his belief that black people worldwide were part of a common struggle for freedom. Malcolm X was also welcomed in Ghana and met with Nkrumah, strengthening his Pan-African vision. Ghana was and continues to be a safe haven for African Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois moved to Ghana and was given Ghanaian citizenship, where he worked on the Encyclopedia Africana until his death in 1963.
So here is another African embellishing the role that black immigrants played in the black American liberation struggle. So let's break it down. Kwame Ture. How many black Americans today even know who Kwame Ture or who Stokely Carmichael was? Very few. And he didn't really get any legislation passed. Malcolm X was a great inspiration to black Americans. Malcolm X's father was Black American, and Malcolm X was assimilated into the Black American culture. I don't even know why they keep trying to drag him back to the Caribbean. Most people didn't even know he was of Caribbean lineage because he had assimilated into the Black American culture, just like Minister Farrakhan. Minister Farrakhan probably has a greater impact since Malcolm X of anybody from the Caribbean. And Minister Farrakhan proudly speaks of his Jamaican ancestry, but he has assimilated into Black American society. So people think he's a Black American. And then I'm not going to say anything about Marcus Garvey until somebody can explain to me why Marcus Garvey came to the United States dressed as an imperialist king of Europe, riding around in an imperialist car, calling himself the provisional king of Africa, had never been to Africa. Africans had not elected or selected him to be their king, and he was going to take all of these Black Americans back to Africa and take them where? He didn't even have a relationship with an African leader. I'm just tired of hearing about Marcus Garvey, and I'll just be honest about that. Let's move on. Let's let her continue.
And then let's not forget to talk about the support by Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie I. He was deeply respected by African American leaders, including Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and members of the Nation of Islam. Ethiopia used its position in the United Nations to push against apartheid in South Africa and racial discrimination in the US. He was a key force in the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which worked to connect African struggles with Black liberation struggles worldwide. Historically, African Americans and Africans on the continent have always supported each other in their liberation struggle. When Italy invaded Ethiopia during the Second World War, so many African Americans signed up to volunteer to fight on the side of the Ethiopians against the invading colonial Italian army. However, eventually they were blocked from the US government. They were ready to die and fight for Ethiopia. Imagine that. However, one brother made it, Colonel John Robinson, the Brown Condor of Harlem. You should definitely research his mind-blowing, inspiring history. He was one of the very few African American Black aviators of his time, and he showed solidarity with Ethiopia by volunteering as a fighter pilot and military advisor during Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, defying racial barriers and US neutrality policies. He helped train Ethiopian pilots, fought against Mussolini's forces, and symbolized African American support for anti-colonial struggles in Africa.
Now, this is the one point that I really agree with her. Emperor Haile Selassie was the first African leader that championed Pan-Africanism. He was the African leader that founded the Organization of African Unity. He understood what white supremacy was doing in the world way back in the early part of the 20th century. He tried to unite the African nations. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Black Americans signed up in droves to go to Ethiopia to fight against those Italians, and the United States government would not let them go. But there was one Tuskegee Airman that went to Ethiopia and helped them to establish their Air Force. And to this day, they recognize John Robinson, so she's right about that. And I believe that might have something to do with the fact that Ethiopians do not come to this country keeping up mess with Black Americans. They keep their own council. Matter of fact, Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City was built by Black Americans and Ethiopians. So there's a different kind of relationship between Black Americans and Ethiopians. But what has happened over the years is that, number one, the white supremacists deposed Haile Selassie and ran him out of the country, just like they do all of the African leaders who stand up or who stand up to them or try to unite the African people. They will either kill them or they will run them out of their country. They don't want anybody in Africa that African people can look up to with pride. And I do have to say this. I would be remiss if I didn't say this, but Many of the people in the Horn of Africa, that would include Ethiopians and Somalis and Eritreans and Djiboutis, they have more of an admixture than some of the other African nations. And I don't know whether it was the white supremacists that got to them or that they have always thought that, but they have othered themselves somewhere along the way, that they're better, that they are different, let's put it that way, than the other Africans. So that causes division too.
Not just historically, African people continue to support the Black liberation struggle in the USA and are actively involved in racial justice movements. Many activists that fight against racism and oppression in America are of Caribbean and African descent. In cities like Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, Ethiopian and Somali communities were on the front lines of the protests. And even in Ethiopia, I was in Addis Ababa at that time, Ethiopians came together to mourn the murder and the death of George Floyd and came together in solidarity with their Black brothers and sisters in America. The idea that FBAs were left to fight alone ignores centuries of African and Caribbean solidarity in Black liberation movements.
So once again, I'm disagreeing with the person that wrote that letter. Everybody in the world came together with that George Floyd tragedy. Everybody was appalled by what happened to George Floyd. But really, she said Ethiopians and Somalis came together. So you see, there again, she's making a case for Ethiopians. Ethiopians are not the problem in the United States.
African nations provided sanctuary, funding, and diplomatic pressure to assist Black struggles in the US. Pan-African leaders recognized the shared fight for Black liberation, understanding that oppression in the US was linked to colonialism and apartheid in Africa. Without Africa's contributions, the civil rights movement and Black power movements would have been much weaker.
Well, all I can say is I'm going to have to research that to see what the Africans did to make the civil rights movement stronger, because I'm not aware of what they did. And if anybody is aware, please let me know. Going to Africa and shaking hands with an African leader did not impact the civil rights movement, in my opinion. But, if y'all know something, let me know.
Could there be more unity? Of course. But erasing contributions because of a few bad experiences? That's not historical accuracy. That's emotional reasoning. So the question to those who push the FBA ideology is this. If African people and African leaders have fought for and supported Black liberation movements in the US, why continue pushing division instead of solidarity? Let's get to the next point. Point number 3.
I just call bullshit on what she just said. For her to say that Africans did so much for the civil rights movement and now FBA are pushing division is emotional and something else she called that. I just call BS on that, because that is just absolutely absurd. Because Africans have been the most divisive of anybody. And so nobody's lying on them. They're just going to have to accept that FBA are in a different place now.
Black immigrants look down on FBAs and want proximity to whiteness. This argument is rooted in personal experience, not systemic reality. Yes, some immigrants have internalized anti-Blackness. Unfortunately, that's a colonial legacy that exists in most places in the world, in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America. But so have many African Americans and people identifying as foundational Black Americans. There is a reason why colorism, classism, and internalized racism exists within all Black communities, including the US. Yes, it's true, some immigrants distance themselves from African Americans. But let's be real, many FBAs do the same thing. If we are keeping it honest, many FBAs hold negative stereotypes about Africans, calling them jungle people, booty scratchers, mocking their accents, or dismissing them as fresh off the boat. I have seen so many stand-up comedy shows where African Americans were mocking Africans.
So what I see here is her making excuses for what the Africans do and pointing a finger at what Black Americans do. Like, well, we're doing this because that, but you are doing yours because you're being divisive. So I disagree with her there. But I do agree with her. I do not like this making fun of other people. I do not like it. And a lot of these Black American comedians are not funny anyway. They make fun of Black women. They make fun of Black mothers. They make fun of everybody in the name of I'm a comedian. I'm a comedian. I don't go for that kind of humor. So I agree with her there.
The solution is not more division, fam. It's confronting anti-blackness wherever it exists, whether in the Caribbean, in Africa, or among African Americans. Let's get to the next point. Point number 4 about the fight. This argument is reductionist and misleading. If FBAs really want to understand why African immigrants focus on making money instead of activism, they need to understand how the US has actively destroyed Africa through imperialism. Let's take the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, for instance. Patrice Lumumba was the first democratically elected leader of the Congo. The US and Belgium orchestrated his assassination because he wanted to keep Congo's resources out of Western hands. His death led to decades of dictatorship and resource exploitation. And this pattern repeated itself across the African continent. The US supported apartheid South Africa, keeping Nelson Mandela in prison, and the CIA helped overthrow Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah. African economies were crippled by IMF and World Bank policies designed to keep them dependent. So when African immigrants come to the US to work hard and build wealth, it's often because their home countries were robbed by the same American system that oppresses African Americans. I mean, let's be real. Why should African immigrants feel guilty for simply wanting a better life when the US played a key role in keeping Africa underdeveloped? Some FBAs call African immigrants cowards for fleeing their country. But let's be real for a second. If you lived in a war-torn country or a collapsed economy, wouldn't you leave for a better future? This doesn't mean they hate FBAs. It means they are survivors, just like the enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage. You know, when Africans come to America, their first instinct is survival. Not because they don't care about black struggles, but because they are literally trying to lift their families out of generational poverty.
Okay, all right. Okay, Miss Lady, you're making a good case for them, and you're making it sound like they're so humble and they're so good and they're just here for good intentions. That's not what FBA sees. FBA sees arrogance, and when they throw arrogance out there, FBA throws arrogance back. I'm not saying it's right, but that's just what's happening. And all of this, oh, they just want to work hard and they want to build wealth and they want to do this. You can do that and keep your damn mouth shut. And that is not what they're doing. And that's why they're getting this pushback that apparently they can't take. And as far as how the United States operates in the world, we know that better than anybody. We don't need anybody to tell us how they operate. That's what the ones back in the day were trying to tell you. But you didn't want to hear it then.
Let's get to the next point. Number 5. The lie that FBAs are indigenous to America. Many FBA supporters now push the outrageous claim that they are indigenous to the US and that some of them were in America before the transatlantic slave trade, as if they have no connection to Africa. Let's be clear, this is the highest form of self-hate.
Well. She finally gets to the meat of it. She is concerned about what FBA call themselves. What's more problematic is that she's concerned about something that has absolutely nothing to do with her. So now she's going to psychoanalyze FBA from Kenya. I don't believe that she fully understands what FBA are saying when they say that. FBA have the right to go on their own journey of self-discovery. And they don't need anybody's permission to do that. I am content to let people go on their own journey of self-discovery. And it does not mean that they're self-hating because you don't appreciate the journey that they're going on. And if she was really an anthropologist, as she claims to be, she would do more research. She would talk to the people who are saying that they are indigenous to the United States and look at the data that they have and then take it or leave it. But to sit over there in Africa and try to tell somebody What they are not is very ignorant.
Genetic and historical evidence confirms that African Americans are of African descent, primarily from West and Central Africa. There is not a single evidence of a massive black indigenous population in the US before the 15th century. And the evidence that some of the FBAs bring are ridiculous, hilarious. Like recently, I saw this post.
Now, this lets you know that she doesn't think that FBA are very intelligent. This is somebody's idea of a joke. How are cornrows African when corn is indigenous to America? That's somebody's idea of a joke. Nobody would look at this and take this seriously. Probably something some African came up with. I don't understand why they're concerned about FBA's identity. It has nothing to do with them. And it's insulting the way they get all invested in this. It's none of their business.
I just shake my head. I just shake my head. Let's just leave it there, okay? The truth is, the transatlantic slave trade forcibly brought millions of Africans to the Americas. This is not up for debate, fam, and it's nothing to be ashamed of.
We're not ashamed of anything. What's infuriating is that you people won't stay the hell out of our business. They keep bringing up the transatlantic slave trade because they think we're ashamed of it. We are not ashamed of it. We have transcended that and we have survived. We're getting on with our lives. We are getting on with our lives. We're not stuck in the past.
In my humble opinion, this narrative is nothing more than an attempt to erase African ancestry. The very thing that white supremacy has always tried to do. I mean, if FBAs believe they were always in America, why are there DNA results linking them to Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Congo, and Angola? This is not black empowerment, fam. I'm sorry to say, but this is black and African erasure. Did Africans arrive in the Americas before the arrival of Columbus? Definitely. If you want to learn more about that, study the massive expedition of King Abu Bakari II of Mali, who arrived in America approximately 200 years before Columbus.
So, did she contradict herself? Did she say there were no black people here before Columbus and now she's saying there were because she went to St. Vincent? So, I guess they were all in St. Vincent, but none of them made it this far north, I guess.
Last but not least, point number 7, the victim mentality in FBA rhetoric. Very problematic. One of the biggest problems with the FBA ideology is that it thrives on a victim mentality, blaming everyone, including Africans, for their struggles instead of focusing on solutions and unity. Also, I noticed a widespread belief among African Americans and especially among FBAs that Africans hate them. All I can say about this false claim is please visit the African continent and make your own experience. I promise you, you will feel the love, you will feel welcomed, you will feel accepted, and you will feel valued, celebrated. Please visit the African continent and make your own experience. This is one of the most vicious lies that I've heard in my life, in my entire life, and I can guarantee you, this is by design. This vicious lie has been spread to keep us apart, to keep us from uniting and from building together. You need to stop this constant talk about how much we gave and how little we received in return from African immigrants and Caribbean people, because it ignores the fact that the black struggle is global, fam. It's global. African Americans have suffered, yes, nobody is denying that, but they have also benefited from African labor, African resources, and African political support. Plus, believe me when I say this victim-perpetrator binary doesn't help anyone. In fact, for some people, it's inconceivable that victims can be perpetrators too.
Well, I'm going to leave it there because she goes on and on talking about things that she doesn't know anything about. What we call history is what they call playing the victim. I don't even know if they know their history. or if their history is documented. They're so busy running that they probably don't even take time to learn what history they have. We're in America talking about our experience in America. They are coming here making a judgment, won't stay in their own homeland and fight with their people. When they have leaders in Africa, as they have now, they won't stay there and fight with their leaders to take charge of their resources to make their countries better like they do everywhere else in the world. They run. So they don't understand it when they come into contact with people like us. This country would not be the country that it is, one that they could run to, if we hadn't taken a stand based on our history. Now, what we would ask of them is just to stay out of our business. They are runners. They run away from their responsibility in their countries. So, these Africans, you are the last people on earth to lecture Black Americans. And I find this whole post misguided, to say the least. And as far as that letter she claims she got from an FBA, she can take that letter and stick it in wherever she makes a fire. That letter is nothing but a piece of trash. So it just needs to be burned and never mentioned again. Okay, y'all, thank you for listening. Let me know what you think about the video. Give me a thumbs up and have a good evening.